You're a burden. I sold Dad's company. Good luck paying rent. My son said those words while standing in the middle of my living room. Just like that. Not quietly. Not awkwardly. Not even with a hint of hesitation. He said it the way people announce the weather. Calm. Casual. Final. For a moment, the entire room went silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of the old wall clock above the fireplace, the one my husband Thomas had insisted on hanging there 20 years ago because, in his words, every home should have a heartbeat. I stared at Daniel. My son. 42 years old now. Tall like his father, sharp jawline, expensive watch glinting under the chandelier light. Beside him stood his wife, Vanessa, holding a glass of red wine with the kind of relaxed confidence people have when they believe the room belongs to them. Neither of them looked uncomfortable. Neither of them looked ashamed. And that was the part that surprised me the most. 3 months earlier, I had buried my husband. 37 years of marriage lowered gently into the earth beneath a gray October sky. People had filled the church that day. Employees from the company. Old friends. Neighbors who had watched our family grow from a small struggling household into something stable and respectable. Everyone told me the same thing. Thomas built something remarkable. They were right. But Thomas had never cared about being remarkable. He cared about building things that lasted. Homes. Relationships. A company that treated people fairly. And, most importantly, a family. Or at least, that's what we both believed. Now I was standing in the house we had shared for nearly 4 decades, listening to our only son explain why I was suddenly a problem that needed solving. You're not listening, Mom, Daniel said after a moment, noticing my silence. His voice carried that same impatient tone he used to have as a teenager whenever I asked him to clean his room. I am listening, I replied calmly. My voice surprised even me. It sounded steady. Almost peaceful. Inside, something deeper was shifting. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Clarity. Daniel ran a hand through his hair and glanced briefly at Vanessa, as if silently asking for support. She gave him a small encouraging nod. Look, he continued, spreading his hands like a man explaining a simple business decision, this is just reality. Dad's company was too much responsibility. The market's changing. Construction margins are tighter than ever. He said the word Dad quickly, almost like an afterthought. Not your father, not the man who built it, just Dad. I got a great offer, Daniel went on. $12 million. Cash. Vanessa smiled slightly at that number. 12 million, she repeated softly, swirling the wine in her glass. The way she said it made the number feel less like a business transaction and more like a trophy. I folded my hands gently in my lap. For 35 years, Thomas had built that company from the ground up. He started with a rusted pickup truck and a borrowed set of tools. I still remember the early mornings when he would leave before sunrise, thermos of black coffee in one hand, blueprints rolled under his arm. Sometimes he came home so tired he could barely keep his eyes open during dinner. But he always smiled. Another wall went up today, he'd say. Or, we hired 2 more workers. Little victories. Brick by brick. Year by year. Until that tiny contracting business had grown into a company that employed more than 200 people across the state. And now my son had sold it in a single afternoon. You should be happy for us, Vanessa added suddenly. Her voice was smooth and pleasant, the way people sound when they believe they're being perfectly reasonable. We're thinking about investing in real estate. Maybe something in Miami. Or Austin. The markets there are incredible right now. Daniel nodded eagerly. Exactly. This is a smart move. Dad would have understood that. For the first time, I looked directly at him. Your father would have understood? The sentence floated through my mind slowly. Thomas had spent his entire life building that company so Daniel could inherit something meaningful. Not just money. Responsibility. Legacy. But I said none of that. Instead, I asked a simple question. When did you sell it? Last week, Daniel replied. Last week. 7 days. 7 days after I had finished writing thank you notes to people who attended Thomas's funeral. 7 days after the flowers on the dining room table had started to wilt. 7 days after I had stood alone in the backyard staring at the workshop where Thomas used to spend his evenings fixing tools and sketching future projects. You didn't mention it, I said quietly. Daniel shifted his weight. Well, we wanted to finalize everything first. Vanessa leaned slightly against the arm of the couch. Honestly, she said, it's probably better this way. These things can get emotional. Emotional. The word hung in the air like a faint insult wrapped in politeness. Then Daniel cleared his throat. And about the house, there it was. The real reason for this conversation. I could feel it before he finished the sentence. This place is too big for you now, he said. I glanced around the room. The living room walls were lined with photographs. Daniel as a child holding his first baseball glove. Family vacations at the lake. Thomas standing proudly beside the first office building his company ever constructed. Too big for me. I managed just fine, I replied. Vanessa gave a soft laugh. But the property taxes alone are almost $9,000 a year, she said. Plus maintenance, utilities, it's just not practical. Practical. That word again. Daniel crossed his arms. And honestly, Mom, you don't really have the income for this anymore. Then he said it. The sentence that changed everything. You're a burden. I sold Dad's company. Good luck paying rent. For a few seconds, no one moved. The clock ticked steadily above the fireplace. Tick. 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 I slowly lifted my teacup and took a small sip. The tea had gone cold. Then I set the cup down and looked at my son. And I smiled. Daniel, I said gently. If you believe that, then you've made a very serious mistake. The smile stayed on my face, but inside, my thoughts had already traveled years back. Back to a small garage on the edge of town. Back to a man covered in sawdust and sweat, wiping his hands on a faded blue rag while explaining to me why he refused to give up on a dream that, at the time, seemed almost impossible. My husband, Thomas, had never been the kind of man who chased shortcuts. He believed in foundations. Anything worth building, he used to say, tapping the side of his coffee mug for emphasis, has to start with something strong enough to hold the weight later. That was the way he approached everything. Houses. Businesses. Families. For 35 years, that belief guided the company he built from nothing. I remembered the first office vividly. It wasn't really an office at all, just a narrow room attached to the garage of a rented warehouse. The paint peeled from the walls, and the only furniture was a folding desk, 2 mismatched chairs, and a dented filing cabinet someone had thrown away. Thomas loved that room. He used to sit there late at night, studying contracts under a single buzzing fluorescent light while I brought him sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Someday, he told me once, looking up from a stack of invoices, Daniel will run this place. Our son had been 10 years old at the time, asleep upstairs with a toy truck clutched in his hand. I had laughed softly. You're already planning his career? Thomas grinned. I'm planning his future. He wasn't talking about money. He never was. To Thomas, the company wasn't just a business. It was a promise. A promise that our son would inherit something meaningful. Something built with patience. Something that required care. But standing there in my living room now, listening to Daniel casually explain why selling it had been the smart move, I realized something painful. Thomas had believed Daniel would understand that promise. I wasn't so sure anymore. Daniel misread my silence. He shifted awkwardly and gestured toward the kitchen. "Look, Mom, we're not trying to hurt you," he said. "We're actually trying to make things easier." Vanessa nodded immediately. "Yes, exactly," she added. "You deserve something simpler. Something smaller." Her tone had softened, but the calculation in her eyes hadn't changed. "You've lived in this house for a long time," she continued. 40 years, right?" 37, I replied. "Well," she said lightly, "that's exactly the point. It's time for a change." I glanced toward the staircase. The banister still had the faint scratch marks Daniel made when he was 8 years old and tried to slide down it with a toy sword. Thomas had refused to sand them out. "Leave it," he said back then. "One day we'll miss those little scars." I wondered what he would say now. Daniel stepped closer. "We already talked to a realtor," he said. "Of course you did. They think the property could sell for around $1.8 million, he continued. "Maybe more." Vanessa smiled again. "Especially with the new development going up near the highway. Buyers love land like this." I watched the two of them carefully. They spoke about the house the same way. Investors discuss a stock. Value. Timing. Opportunity. Not memories. Not history. Just numbers. "And where exactly," I asked calmly, "do you suggest I live?" Daniel seemed relieved to hear the question. He glanced at Vanessa again. "We found a great condo complex downtown," he said quickly. "Small, modern, secure. Elevator building, underground parking, all the amenities." Vanessa lifted her phone and began scrolling. "I saved the listing," she said. 2 bedrooms, though honestly you'd only need 1. She turned the screen toward me. The photo showed a sleek gray building with glass balconies and neatly trimmed landscaping. It looked clean. Efficient. Completely anonymous. "What's the rent?" I asked. Daniel hesitated. Then he shrugged. "About $3,500 a month." I almost laughed. Instead, I leaned back slightly in my chair. "And you believe I can afford that?" Daniel exhaled. "Well, that's why we're having this conversation." There it was again. The tone. Patient. Reasonable. As if I were a problem that required careful management. "You see," Vanessa said gently, folding her arms, "now that the company is sold, your financial situation has changed." I raised an eyebrow. "Has it?" She smiled politely. "Well, Daniel inherited the business. And now that it's been liquidated, those assets have already been reinvested." Daniel nodded. "We moved quickly," he added. "Markets are unpredictable." "So the $12 million, I said slowly, is already gone?" "Not gone," Vanessa corrected. "Allocated." "Allocated," I repeated. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "We're diversifying. Real estate funds, tech startups, some international investments." "And none of that," I said quietly, "involves your mother." The room grew still. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "Mom, that money came from the company," he said. "Yes," I agreed. "The company your father left to me." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I studied his face carefully. There it was. The confidence. The certainty. The belief that everything had already been decided. That there was no one left who could challenge his authority. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Because Daniel had made one very dangerous assumption. He believed his father had left the company entirely in his hands. And that assumption was about to cost him. I reached slowly for my teacup again. Still cold. Still bitter. much like the conversation unfolding in front of me. Daniel, I said quietly. Yes? When exactly did the sale finalize? 3 days ago, he replied. And the paperwork? All signed. Completely? He frowned slightly. What do you mean? I set the teacup down again and folded my hands. Nothing, I said softly. Then I looked at both of them. You should probably sit down. Vanessa's smile faltered. Daniel frowned. Why? I met his eyes calmly. Because the next thing I'm about to tell you, I said, is going to make this evening much more complicated than you expected. Daniel didn't sit. Instead, he crossed his arms, the way he used to when he was younger and thought stubbornness could win an argument. Mom, he said with a tired sigh, if this is about Dad's memory, we've already talked about that. Vanessa nodded slightly beside him. Yes, she added softly, we understand this is emotional for you. Emotional. That word again. It seemed to be their favorite explanation for everything that didn't fit neatly into their plans. I studied their faces for a moment. It struck me how confident they looked. Not arrogant exactly. Just certain. Certain that the story had already ended. Certain that every decision had already been made. Certain that I had no more moves left. Daniel walked over to the sideboard and poured himself another glass of wine. You should really try to see the bigger picture here, he said, taking a slow sip. The company was valuable, but the industry's changing. Selling now was the smartest financial decision. Vanessa nodded again. And we moved fast, she added. Which is why the deal went through so smoothly. I tilted my head slightly. Smoothly. Daniel gestured toward her. Vanessa handled most of the negotiations, he said proudly. Her brother works in private equity. He connected us with the buyers. That explained a lot. Vanessa straightened a little at the compliment. They were very eager, she said. When they saw the company's numbers, they didn't hesitate. I leaned back in my chair. How much due diligence did they do? Daniel frowned. What? The buyers, I clarified calmly. How carefully did they review the company before purchasing it? He shrugged. They looked at the financials. Contracts. The usual things. Vanessa waved a hand dismissively. They hired a law firm. That's standard. I nodded slowly. And the ownership structure? That made Daniel pause. What about it? I folded my hands together. Did they ask about the ownership structure of the company? Daniel's brow creased slightly. Of course they did. And what did you tell them? That I owned it, he said. His voice carried a small edge now. Which I do. I watched him quietly. Vanessa crossed her arms. Daniel inherited the company from his father, she said. Everyone knows that. I nodded once. Yes, I said. That's what everyone believes. The room fell still again. Daniel frowned more deeply. What's that supposed to mean? I didn't answer right away. Instead, my eyes drifted to the photograph on the wall above the fireplace. It showed Thomas standing in front of the company's first completed commercial building. He was younger in that picture. Stronger. Proud. Daniel had been standing beside him that day, barely 20, wearing a hard hat that kept slipping down over his eyes. Thomas had his arm around his shoulders. I remembered what he said after the photo was taken. Everything I build, he told Daniel, is for you someday. At the time, Daniel had grinned and said the words every young man says when he feels invincible. I won't mess it up, Dad. But promises made at 20 are easy. Keeping them is harder. Daniel followed my gaze toward the photograph. Mom, he said impatiently, what are you getting at? I stood up slowly. The hardwood floor creaked beneath my feet, the the same familiar sound it had made for decades. I walked over to the small writing desk near the window. Thomas had bought that desk for me on our 10th anniversary. He said every home deserved a place where important things could be kept safe. Inside the top drawer was a leather folder. Dark brown. Slightly worn at the corners. I pulled it out carefully and turned back toward them. Vanessa's eyes narrowed immediately. "What's that?" Daniel looked irritated now. "Mom, if this is some old paperwork, it is," I said calmly. "Very old paperwork." I walked back to the coffee table and placed the folder gently on the wood. Neither of them moved. "You should sit," I repeated. This time, Daniel hesitated. Vanessa glanced at him. Something in my voice must have sounded different. Because after a moment, Daniel slowly lowered himself onto the couch. Vanessa sat beside him, though her posture remained stiff and alert. I opened the folder. Inside were several documents. Some of them yellowed slightly with age. Others crisp and newer. The first page I lifted was thick with official seals. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What is that?" I slid the paper across the table toward him. "Corporate ownership documents," I said quietly. Vanessa leaned closer as well. Daniel picked up the paper. At first, his expression showed only mild confusion. Then his eyes moved down the page. And the confusion turned into something else. His forehead creased. "What?" Vanessa grabbed the page from his hands and scanned it quickly. The color drained from her face almost instantly. "That can't be right," she whispered. I watched them calmly. "You see," I said softly, 3 years ago, your father made a change." Daniel looked up sharply. "What kind of change?" I folded my hands again. "The kind," I replied, "that makes selling the company a lot more complicated than you think." Daniel stared at the document as if the words might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. "They're wrong," he said finally. His voice sounded tight. Vanessa leaned closer to the paper again, her fingers sliding down the page, scanning the lines more carefully. "Daniel," she murmured. He snatched the document back from her hands. "No," he said firmly. "This is some old record. Maybe before Dad transferred everything." I said nothing. The silence seemed to make him more uncomfortable than any argument would have. He flipped the page over, searching for something that would confirm what he already believed. Vanessa reached into the folder and pulled out the second document. Her eyes moved quickly. Then she stopped. "Daniel," she said again. This time her voice had lost its confidence. "Look at the date." Daniel glanced over. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Then his head snapped up toward me. "This says 3 years ago." "Yes," I replied calmly. "That's correct." Vanessa slowly lowered the paper onto the table. "But, that means," she didn't finish the sentence. "She didn't have to." Daniel looked down again, reading the line that had caught her attention. Majority Ownership Transfer Agreement. The title sat at the top of the page in bold legal lettering. Beneath it were 2 names. Thomas Carter. And mine. 51%? Daniel said quietly. I nodded. "Your father transferred 51% of the company to me." The room fell completely silent. Even the ticking clock above the fireplace seemed louder now. Daniel shook his head slowly. "That doesn't make any sense." It made perfect sense. "To your father," I said. Vanessa leaned forward again. "That would mean," she said carefully, "that Daniel only owned 49%. "Yes." Daniel stood up suddenly. "No," he snapped. "That's impossible. Dad told me the company would be mine." "It is yours," I said gently. "Part of it." He stared at me. "You're saying I didn't have full control?" "I'm saying," I replied, that your father believed leadership should be shared with someone he trusted. Daniel's expression darkened. And that someone was you? Yes. Vanessa pushed the folder toward me. But Daniel signed the sale agreement, she said quickly. The buyers accepted it. The deal closed. Did it? I asked. Daniel's jaw tightened. Yes. It did. I tilted my head slightly. Daniel, did you inform the buyers that you owned only 49% of the company? He didn't answer immediately. Vanessa looked at him. Daniel? I told them I inherited the business, he said defensively. That wasn't the question. The tension in the room thickened. Vanessa spoke slowly. Daniel, did they see these documents? His silence was the answer. For the first time since the conversation began, Vanessa looked genuinely worried. You told them you had full authority to sell, she said quietly. Daniel rubbed his temple. Well, yes. I leaned back in my chair. That's unfortunate. Both of them looked at me at the same time. Why? Daniel asked. Before I could answer, his phone buzzed loudly on the coffee table. The sudden sound made everyone jump slightly. Daniel glanced at the screen. A number he didn't recognize. He hesitated. Then he answered. Hello? For a few seconds he listened silently. His expression shifted almost immediately. What? Vanessa sat up straighter. What is it? Daniel turned slightly away, pressing the phone closer to his ear. No, that's not possible, he said into the receiver. Another pause. His face went pale. You're telling me the contract isn't valid? Vanessa stood. What's happening? Daniel swallowed. They say the sale might be void. The words came out slowly, like he was struggling to believe them himself. He listened again. Yes. I understand. Then his voice dropped to a whisper. You're saying we could be liable? Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth. Daniel ended the call and stared at the phone for a long moment. What did they say? She asked. His voice sounded hollow now. The buyer's legal team reviewed the ownership records. He looked up at me. They found the transfer. Vanessa's eyes widened. And? Daniel exhaled slowly. They say I didn't have the authority to sell the company. The room was quiet again. But this time, the silence felt very different. Vanessa turned toward me. You knew this would happen. It wasn't a question. I folded my hands calmly. I suspected it might. Daniel stared at the documents spread across the table. The confidence that had filled the room earlier had completely vanished. What do they want? Vanessa asked. Daniel hesitated. Then he said the words that changed the tone of the evening completely. They want to speak with the majority owner. He looked directly at me. They want to speak with you. Daniel kept staring at me as if he were seeing a completely different person than the woman he had walked into this house to confront. The majority owner, he repeated quietly. Vanessa slowly sank back onto the couch beside him. For the first time since they arrived that evening, neither of them looked confident. Neither of them looked certain. In fact, they looked exactly the way people look when the ground beneath their feet begins to shift. Daniel rubbed his forehead. They want to talk to you, he said again. Yes, I replied calmly. You mentioned that. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice tense. What exactly did they say? Daniel hesitated. They said the deal can't proceed without the authorization of the majority shareholder. Vanessa swallowed. And that's you. Yes. The word hung in the room like a quiet verdict. Daniel suddenly stood and began pacing across the living room. This is insane, he muttered. They already wired the first payment. Vanessa's head snapped toward him. They did? Daniel nodded. 2 million as an initial transfer. Vanessa's eyes widened. And now? Daniel stopped pacing. They've frozen the rest of the transaction until the ownership issue is resolved. He turned toward me again. They want a meeting tomorrow morning. I nodded slightly. That sounds reasonable. Vanessa looked between the two of us, her mind clearly racing. Wait, she said suddenly. This doesn't make sense. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? If they already wired money, she said carefully, they can't just walk away. I tilted my head. Oh, they can. Both of them looked at me. When a company is sold under false authority, I explained calmly, buyers have several legal protections. Vanessa's face tightened. You're implying Daniel committed fraud. I'm implying, I said gently, that the lawyers will decide what to call it. Daniel slammed his hand lightly against the back of a chair. I didn't lie, he said defensively. I believed the company was mine. And that belief, I replied, was unfortunately incorrect. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said so far. Vanessa leaned forward again. So what happens now? I looked at her. That depends. On what? On what the majority owner decides to do. Daniel stopped pacing. You mean you? Yes. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel let out a slow breath. Mom, this doesn't have to become a disaster. I raised an eyebrow slightly. No? No, he said quickly. We can fix this. Vanessa nodded immediately. Yes. Exactly. Daniel walked back toward the coffee table. All you have to do is sign the authorization. I watched him carefully. The authorization? Yeah, he said. You approve the sale. The lawyers update the paperwork. Problem solved. Vanessa leaned forward eagerly. The buyers are offering 12 million, she added. That's an incredible valuation. I studied both of them for a long moment. You're asking me to approve the sale of the company. Daniel spread his hands. Yes. The company your father spent 35 years building. Yes. The company you sold without asking me. Daniel hesitated. Well, yes. Vanessa quickly jumped in. But the outcome benefits everyone. Everyone? I repeated. Yes, she said. You'd receive your portion of the proceeds. And what portion would that be? Vanessa paused. Then she said carefully, well, technically 51%. Daniel nodded quickly. Exactly. I leaned back in my chair. So if I sign this authorization, I said slowly, I receive 51% of $12 million. Correct, Daniel replied. And if I don't? The question lingered in the air. Daniel's expression tightened. Well, then the deal collapses. And the buyers may sue, Vanessa added quietly. I nodded. Possibly. Daniel stepped closer. Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. His voice had softened now. Almost pleading. We already told the investors the deal was done. Vanessa spoke again. The markets are moving fast. Opportunities like this don't come twice. I looked at both of them. Their urgency was obvious now. Not confidence. Not pride. Fear. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself a small, thoughtful smile. You know, I said gently, your father once told me something interesting. Daniel frowned. What? He said the most important moment in any negotiation, I paused, is the moment when the other side realizes they actually need you. Neither of them spoke. The ticking clock filled the silence again. Tick. 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 Then I folded my hands calmly in my lap. And tonight, I continued quietly, I believe we've just reached that moment. Daniel looked at me for a long moment, trying to read something in my face. For years, he had been able to predict my reactions easily. When he was a child, I was the mother who packed his lunches, signed his school forms, and waited up when he came home late. Later, when he became an adult, I was the one who listened when he complained about work, when business deals fell apart, when life didn't move as quickly as he wanted. To Daniel, I had always been predictable. Patient. Supportive. Safe. But tonight, something about the way I sat there, calm, quiet, and completely unmoved, clearly unsettled him. Mom, he said carefully, we're not enemies here. Vanessa nodded immediately. Exactly, she added. We're family. Family. The word felt almost ironic after the conversation that had started this evening. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat across from me, leaning forward slightly. Let's just think about this logically, he said. I gestured lightly with my hand. Go on. He exhaled slowly. The buyers want the company, he said. You own 51%. I own 49%. If you approve the deal, everyone walks away happy. Vanessa quickly added, and very wealthy. Daniel continued. You'd receive over $6 million. He said the number like it should impress me. Like it should solve everything. But money had never been the reason Thomas built that company. And Daniel knew that. Or at least, he used to. What happens to the company? I asked. Daniel blinked. What do you mean? The employees, I clarified. The projects. The clients your father spent decades building relationships with. Daniel waved his hand dismissively. The buyers will take care of that. That's not an answer. Vanessa stepped in again. Companies get acquired all the time, she said smoothly. That's how modern business works. I looked at her. Your brother's private equity firm, are they the buyers? She hesitated for half a second. Then she nodded. They're part of the investment group. That explained the urgency. I leaned back slightly. So this deal benefits your family quite nicely. Daniel frowned. It benefits all of us. I studied him for a moment. Daniel, do you know how many people work for Carter Construction right now? He opened his mouth. Then stopped. Vanessa spoke instead. Roughly 200. 217, I corrected quietly. Neither of them said anything. Do you know how many of those employees started working with your father before you even finished college? Daniel looked away. I continued. 43. The numbers sat in the air between us. Your father kept track of every one of them. He knew their spouses' names. Their children. Their mortgages. Because to him, the company wasn't just a business. It was a community. Daniel rubbed his temple again. Mom, that's sentimental thinking. No, I said softly. That's responsibility. Vanessa leaned forward again. But responsibility doesn't pay market value for assets. I smiled slightly. That depends on how you define value. Daniel exhaled sharply. This isn't about philosophy. It's about a signed deal. Is it? I asked. Yes, he said firmly. The investors already transferred $2 million. The rest of the money is waiting. And if I don't approve the sale? I asked again. Vanessa answered this time. Then the investors will pull out. And? They may pursue legal action. I nodded slowly. Yes. That's possible. Daniel leaned forward. Mom, you don't want that. Why not? Because it would drag everyone through courts and lawyers for months. Possibly years, Vanessa added. I folded my hands together. And during that time, I said calmly, the company would continue operating exactly as it has for the last 35 years. Daniel stared at me. You're serious? Yes. The silence returned again. But now it felt different. Less tense. More inevitable. Vanessa finally spoke again. What exactly are you planning to do? I looked at her. Tomorrow morning, I said, I will attend the meeting with the buyers. Daniel nodded quickly. Good. Vanessa relaxed slightly. That's the smart decision. I raised a finger gently. But I didn't say I would approve the sale. Their relief disappeared instantly. Daniel frowned. Then what are you going to say? I met his eyes calmly. The truth. And what's that? I paused for a moment. Then I answered. That the majority owner of Carter Construction, I leaned forward slightly, has no intention of selling it. Daniel stared at me like he had just heard a language he didn't understand. You're not selling, he said slowly. No, the word was quiet, but it landed in the room with the weight of a closing door. Vanessa blinked. That's not realistic, she said. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood up and walked toward the fireplace. My fingers rested lightly on the frame of the photograph hanging above it. Thomas stood there in the picture with a group of employees on the first construction site the company ever completed. Dust on their boots. Sun in their eyes. Pride on every face. You know, I said softly, still looking at the photograph, your father once told me something on the day that picture was taken. Daniel shifted impatiently. Mom, he said a company is like a house, I continued. You don't tear it down just because someone offers to buy the land. I turned back toward them. Daniel rubbed his face. You're making a mistake. Am I? Yes, he said firmly. $12 million is a life-changing opportunity. For whom? I asked. Vanessa answered immediately. For all of us. I smiled faintly. That's interesting. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? It means the first thing you said tonight was that I'm a burden. Neither of them spoke. And now, I continued, suddenly I'm a partner. Vanessa looked uncomfortable. That's not what we meant. It's exactly what you meant. Daniel sighed loudly. So what happens now? Tomorrow, I said calmly, I meet the investors. And then? I tell them the company isn't for sale. Vanessa's voice rose. You can't just throw away $12 million. I looked at her. Watch me. Daniel stood up abruptly. This is unbelievable. He paced across the room again, running both hands through his hair. You're risking everything over pride. No, I said quietly. I'm protecting something your father spent his entire life building. Daniel turned sharply. Dad built it for me. The words echoed through the room. For a moment, none of us moved. Then I answered gently. Yes. He did. Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if he believed the argument was finally turning in his favor. But then I finished the sentence. He built it for the man he hoped he would become. Daniel froze. The silence that followed was deeper than anything that had come before. Vanessa glanced nervously between us. You're being unfair, she said. Am I? Yes. Daniel stepped up after your husband died. He took responsibility. I tilted my head slightly. Selling something you didn't fully own isn't responsibility. Daniel didn't respond. He simply stared at the documents still lying on the table. Finally, after a long moment, he spoke quietly. So what are you going to do with the company? I walked back to my chair and sat down. The same thing your father did. Daniel looked up. Which is? I folded my hands. Run it. Vanessa laughed in disbelief. You? Yes. You're 70 years old. 68, I corrected. Daniel shook his head. You can't manage a construction company. I don't need to, I said. What does that mean? I've already called someone. Daniel frowned. Who? Mark Reynolds. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. Mark had been Thomas's operations director for almost 20 years. A man who knew the company better than anyone except my husband. You talked to Mark? Daniel asked. Yes. When? Yesterday. Vanessa's expression tightened. You were planning this? I was preparing, I replied calmly. For what? For the possibility that your father's company might need protecting. Daniel sank slowly back into his chair. And Mark agreed to help you? Yes. What did he say? I smiled faintly. He said something your father used to tell him all the time. Daniel looked up. What? I glanced once more at Thomas's photograph above the fireplace. Then I said quietly, ***, good companies aren't destroyed by competition, ***, I paused. They're destroyed by the wrong people running them. The room went silent. Daniel stared at the floor. Vanessa said nothing. And for the first time that night, neither of them looked angry. They looked small. After a long moment, Daniel stood up. We should go, he said quietly. Vanessa grabbed her purse without speaking. At the door, Daniel stopped. For a second it looked like he might say something. Apologize. Argue again. Explain himself. But in the end, he only nodded once. Then he walked out into the night. The front door closed softly behind them. The house became quiet again. I stood alone in the living room for a moment. The same house Thomas had built. The same walls. The same clock ticking steadily above the fireplace. Tick. 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 I looked up at his photograph and smiled. Well, I said softly into the empty room. Looks like the company isn't finished yet.